We'll begin by exploring the actual experiences of serving on a B-17 Flying Fortress crew, then gradually shift to increasingly grim details, reserving the most shocking revelations for last. To join the ranks of B-17 aircrews, aspiring members naturally needed to complete training beforehand. And that's where our first unsettling reality emerges. At the height of the conflict, when losses were mounting at a terrifying pace, the standard 9-month pilot training regimen was slashed to just 9 to 10 weeks. The same rush schedule applied to gunners, navigators, and bombardiers. It's hardly shocking, then, that roughly 25,000 American airmen perished in training mishaps during the war, with no enemy involvement whatsoever. Not every victim belonged to B-17 units, but most did, since the Flying Fortress served as the primary heavy bomber in the European theatre until the B-24 Liberator and B-29 Superfortress entered service. A key factor behind these crashes was the rigorous practice of tight formations. In the war's early stages, when German interceptors were shredding B-17 groups, pilots adopted ultra-close positioning, with aircraft wings overlapping above and below to maximise the coverage of their onboard machine guns. This setup complicated assaults from the Luftwaffe's fighters, yet maintaining such precise proximity for hours on end, especially amid enemy fire or flak bursts, proved incredibly taxing, let alone mastering it initially. Crews often describe takeoff and assembly in England's dismal, fog-shrouded skies as the mission's toughest phase. Bombers had to launch from runways in rapid succession, spaced only 30 to 45 seconds apart. As one plane approached the runway's end without lifting off, the successor was already rolling behind it. Airborne, they then had to coalesce into formation, sometimes guided by distinctive older B-17 models, dubbed assembly ships, with eye-catching paint schemes for visibility. As you might guess, this led to a staggering tally of mid-air collisions, and attempting it in a fuel and bomb-laden bomber was far from ideal. Assuming you made it through training alive, the next hurdle was enduring the harsh realities of B-17 operations, tougher than it might seem. When the aircraft was designed, cabin pressurization remained largely experimental, so the Flying Fortress operated without it. This lack of pressurization meant no onboard mechanism to regulate air pressure during ascent. As altitude increased, the atmosphere thinned rapidly, causing pressure to plummet. Unlike today's jets with normal breathing conditions, B-17 occupants faced the same external pressure levels. At 20,000 to 30,000 feet, that equated to less than a third of sea level norms, depriving the body of adequate oxygen for normal operations. Inhaling felt akin to drawing breath through a narrow tube. Without supplemental oxygen, disorientation and dizziness set in within minutes, followed by unconsciousness. Layer on the sub-zero chill and howling gusts seeping through every gunner's port, and you get a sense of the brutal cockpit they endured. Crews essentially piloted at 200 miles per hour along a high-altitude road in an open-air convertible, but at 30,000 feet, where temps hovered around -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Thus, the top threats en route to the target, before any foes appeared, were hypoxia and severe frostbite. To counter this, Flying Fortress teams relied on oxygen masks and heated flight suits. Unfortunately, both setups were prone to failure, and traversing enemy skies meant constant threats from the Germans' arsenal aimed at halting raids on their territory. A single high-velocity incendiary, like the countless flak rounds or bursts from pursuing Luftwaffe fighters' cannons and guns, could pierce the thin aluminum fuselage and wreck the gear, leaving you doomed. The primary oxygen supply ran at low pressure on purpose, minimizing explosion risk if struck, while backup walk-around bottles offered brief emergency relief or mobility inside the plane, providing just a few minutes' worth. Beyond that, options were dropping to breathable altitudes or parachuting out. Survivors recounted how a system malfunction would cause someone to simply nod off. If help didn't arrive in 5 minutes, they were lost forever. As for the cold, prolonged high-altitude flights transformed the unpressurized interior into an icy blast chamber. Teams donned blue bunny suits, electrically warmed gear designed to sustain life. Yet just like the oxygen apparatus, these outfits were vulnerable to breakdowns, and either the extreme cold would overheat you or, even worse, cause systems to fail, leading to frostbite or death by hypothermia. Frostbite occurred frequently, and handling machine guns barehanded could result in losing skin or fingers without much effort. The chill was so intense that blood froze right after leaving a wounded body. This isn't exaggeration. Veterans reported it firsthand. It's hard for us to grasp the sheer discomfort and peril of piloting a B-7 in those cumbersome outfits, with a parachute strapped to your back, all while crammed into your station, eyes glued to the sky for incoming enemy fighters. That leads us to the other two primary threats facing B-7 crews after crossing into enemy territory, beyond their own aircraft. Germany's primary defence against aircraft involved high-speed cannons, notoriously called flak. About 1 million personnel operated tens of thousands of these weapons, arranged in defensive rings around key urban and industrial sites that B-17s naturally aim for. Your options were limited. Mostly, you hoped the shells burst far from your plane. Those 88mm flak rounds were directed by German radar and sophisticated fire direction tech that coordinated dozens of guns simultaneously, unleashing barrages in mere moments. Every shell tipped the scales at around 10 kilograms, packing 1 kilogram of explosive. Upon detonation, it spewed shrapnel over a lethal area, slicing effortlessly through the duralumin hull of your bomber and shredding whatever lay beyond, including human tissue. Those are the dark smoke bursts visible in World War II films. At times, the flak clouds grew so dense that crews joked you could step out and stroll across them. Survivors described the horrors flak inflicted on the body in graphic terms. Airmen endured deep mental scars from witnessing friends lose heads or torsos to the fragments. Protective flak jackets offered some cover, but they couldn't shield necks or faces from flying debris. A direct shell strike, particularly before releasing bombs, defied words. Yet the Flying Fortress repeatedly amazed observers by limping back from sorties with massive chunks of the fuselage gone. Some even endured internal explosions from flak, then nursed the craft home sans cockpit, or running on just 1 or 2 of its 4 engines, defying all odds. Fires sparked by German interceptors posed similar risks. As raids grew fiercer, the Germans shifted crack Luftwaffe aces from the east to specifically hunt down bombers. Planes such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109, Fowler-Wolf 190, and the dreaded Me 262 jet that arrived later packed 20 and 30mm autocannons plus hefty machine guns. They even tested early air-to-air rockets against bomber groups, where a single accurate volley could ravage a plane's interior. Initial B-7 variants that the British experimented with lacked tail guns and mounted just a handful of .30 caliber ones. Such setups fared poorly against assaults from fighters. In response, the later Flying Fortress Model G bristled with .50 caliber machine guns in multiple turrets, often doubled up. To counter this, Germans adopted a bold strategy. When facing a B-7 without nose defences, they'd charge straight in and rake the forward section with sustained fire, ripping apart pilots and instruments. This tactic claimed many flying fortresses until forward-firing guns were hastily added. Initially, flying in tight groups offered scant safeguard against enemy pursuits, leading to devastating shoot-downs. The onboard .50 caliber ammo lasted only about a minute of continuous fire overall, due to the load constraints. Thus, when hordes of German fighters swarmed, defences ran dry fast, leaving crews exposed, from the 5,548 US heavy bombers downed in action. Roughly 2,400 fell to flak. Another 2,400 to fighters, and the remaining about 700 to miscellaneous causes like crashes or breakdowns. Certain raids saw B-7s take appalling casualties, largely thanks to interceptors. Planners once thought abundant guns and close formations would suffice. But brutal outings like the U-boat pen strikes, where nearly 20% of B-7s were lost, shattered that illusion. Eventually, escorts such as P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings and Spitfires accompanied the bombers. Upon the Germans' arrival, these allies dove into fierce aerial battles to shield the heavies. The catch: fighters boasted far shorter ranges than the bombers, as they'd been designed for operations near home bases, not probing deep into foe-held lands. The fighters would accompany the bombers for as far as their fuel permitted. Once they reached the point where they had only enough left to return to base, the escorts had no choice but to peel off, forcing the bombers to press ahead unaccompanied. The Allies were targeting crucial factories that manufactured components for German fighter planes, which meant the bombers faced the riskiest stretch of the flight entirely exposed. This vulnerability led to the grim days for B-17 aircrews known as the Two Black Thursdays. The initial one occurred during the Regensburg and Schweinfurt raid on August 17, 1943, featuring a bold dual assault on aircraft production sites far inside Germany. The strategy involved splitting the bombers into two groups to divide the attention of German defences, allowing each to evade concentrated opposition. Post-bombing, one formation was set to divert to North African airfields, while the other headed back to England. Yet poor visibility delayed the groups by hours rather than coordinating them in unison, enabling the Germans to pummel one formation, then the next. Without their protective fighters, which had to head home, the bombers pushed forward solo and were soon overwhelmed by relentless waves of Luftwaffe aircraft that hammered them repeatedly, retreating only briefly to reload and refuel before resuming the assault. The raid inflicted factory damage that was fixed in mere weeks. From the 376 B-17s dispatched, 60 fell to enemy fire, 90 suffered irreparable harm, and roughly 600 crew members perished or vanished, with numerous others ending up in captivity. Undeterred by the disappointing results that fell short of expectations for Allied leaders, they mounted another attempt, vowing to avoid prior errors. That brought the Second Black Thursday, a renewed strike on those identical objectives on October 14, 1943. Radar spotted the incoming bombers early, prompting over 300 Luftwaffe fighters to rise and engage. Of the 291 B-17s sent out, 77 were downed and 120 others badly hit. Once more, around 600 airmen died, went missing, or were seized. In response, these far-reaching missions were paused for a time. The introduction of long-range escorts equipped with drop tanks ultimately addressed the issue, particularly once the P-51 Mustang entered service and could shadow the bombers to Berlin and return. Still, danger remained ever present. Threats from fighters diminished somewhat, but flak persisted right through the war's close. At various stages of the air campaign, the casualties mounted so steeply that Allied planners nearly scrapped the entire effort. Yet at the cost of thousands of bomber personnel and hundreds of thousands of civilian lives, the offensive continued unabated. Some argue the bombing shortened the conflict by a full year, though it may have unleashed needless devastation and civilian suffering. In 1943, typical mission loss rates hovered around 8%, spiking to 30% on the deadliest outings. At that rate of attrition, calculations showed just a third of crews might survive their required 25 missions, a threshold later extended to 30, then 35. Ultimately, about 38% of crews made it through intact, while the rest faced death, imprisonment, or injury. Over 26,000 8th Air Force personnel lost their lives, and more than 28 000 became prisoners. This leads to another troubling reality concerning those who endured long enough to be captured. When it became clear a bomber wouldn't make it back, the pilot would trigger the bailout warning. If possible, he'd keep the plane level on autopilot to aid the crew's escape through tight hatches, burdened by flight gear and cumbersome chutes. Often, though, the aircraft was in a wild spin amid G-forces, with flames possibly raging as the team struggled to exit. Typically, only half the crew succeeded in jumping. Even then, evading a collision with the plummeting bomber was just the start. Their parachutes had to avoid shredding from flak or fire and open correctly. Descending helplessly, they confronted fresh perils. Occasionally, German pilots would machine gun parachutists from above, prompting Allies to design tinier chutes for quicker drops, shortening the window for attacks, though landings became brutal, akin to leaping from a second-story height. Upon reaching Earth, they encountered locals whose loved ones and homes had been ravaged by the very explosives their squadrons unleashed. A few were captured smoothly and held as POWs until liberation. Far too many, however, met a far crueler end. It's no surprise that civilians grieving potential losses from the barrage overhead harboured deep resentment. Nazi messaging branded Allied pilots as terror bombers, a label that in truth held some grim accuracy. Records indicate that roughly 1,000 Allied airmen fell victim to lynchings by furious crowds before the German troops from the regular army weren't always able to take Allied airmen into custody. Take the Russelheim massacre as a case in point, where a furious crowd stoned 6 out of 8 captured flyers to death, and there were plenty of other cases where such atrocities only came to light long after the conflict ended. Post-war courts did prosecute some soldiers and ordinary folks for murdering B-17 crew members in custody, though just a handful received punishment since gathering solid evidence proved incredibly difficult. Once you made it to a POW camp, a tedious, monotonous and grim stretch lay ahead, made far more unbearable if you'd suffered severe wounds during your escape from the plane. Rations were limited, facilities often subpar, and roughly 1,300 imprisoned aircrew perished in detention from all sorts of causes. A number of those who endured until liberation emerged, weighing only 80 pounds, their bodies wrecked by illness. The B-17S alone unleashed around 640,000 tons from the Allies' overall 1.6 million tons of ordnance unleashed across the skies in the war. The devastation these explosives wrought below was pure nightmare fuel. Early on, the aerial campaign focused on factories and army sites, but it soon escalated to pounding any and all things German. The approach shifted to huge assaults and the notorious area bombing technique. On certain outings, swarms of hundreds, sometimes nearing 1,000, B-17S would sweep over urban centres in Germany, reducing them to dust. They unleashed mixtures of blast bombs and firebombs designed to ignite infernos that swallowed entire metropolises in flames. Estimates put German non-combatant fatalities anywhere from 500,000 to 800,000, with over 120 towns left as little more than ruins. You're likely familiar with infamous cases like Dresden, a place with zero military value, which still endured non-stop pounding for more than 3 days under 4,000 tons of explosives that all but erased it from existence. That single operation claimed some 25,000 lives without mercy. Then there was the Hamburg barrage, spanning 10 straight days and killing 40,000 ordinary residents. With all this grim history laid out, now let's turn to the truly astonishing tales, the events that left everyone stunned because they really unfolded. On February 1st, 1943, a squadron of B-17S lifted off from Biskra in Algeria, bound for Tunisia's ports under German control. One of those planes, dubbed the All-American by its team, released its payload and swung around for the 300-mile haul home when a pair of Mi-109 fighters barreled in for a frontal assault, The defensive gunners returned fire, sending the lead enemy down in a blaze. But as the trailing fighter veered off, its pilot took a round and veered wildly out of control. The German craft came within inches of the side gunner before its wing sheared into the All-American's rear section, nearly slicing it clean off the main body. The rear shooter's station clung to the aircraft solely by thin aluminium shreds on the starboard flank and scraps of decking. From a nearby B-17, Lieutenant Charles Cutforth snapped a photo that ranks among the war's most unforgettable aerial shots. A flying fortress dangling its tail by mere threads, yet somehow airborne. With virtually all the tail's control lines severed and key flight components gone, no flight manual would have predicted it staying aloft. Miraculously, though, the automatic pilot was active right at the collision. Relying on electric circuits and powered actuators rather than the damaged manual linkages, the flight crew managed to coax stability from the wreckage as the rear end bucked and lurched. Their comrades eased speed to protect the damaged craft, and against every expectation, the All-American limped home for a safe touchdown with the crew unscathed by major harm. Crews even patched it up and sent it back into action through the war's close. If that seems far-fetched, consider this next one. During a massive strike on the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire, France, on January 3, 1943, ball turret operator Alain Magee, aged 20 and fresh off 6 sorties, flew in the B-17 called Snap, Crackle, Pop. But his 7th run would etch itself into his memory forever. Approaching the objective, the heavens erupted with anti-aircraft fire. One shell crippled an engine, followed by a solid strike that ripped the starboard wing. As the plane tumbled downward in its death throes, Alan fought to escape his cramped perch. The turret measured just 4 feet across at most, so his chute stayed stowed up in the main cabin. In a crisis, he'd have to swivel into position, pop the lid, scramble through, snag the pack, buckle up and bail, all amid potential flames or structural failure, exactly the chaos unfolding here. He clambered forward just to discover his parachute in tatters from shrapnel. At around 20,000 feet, while the B-17 disintegrated, yet another burst slammed in, hurling Alan clear with nothing to slow his drop. Plummeting from nearly 4 miles high, oxygen starvation and biting frost knocked him out cold. Moments later, his limp form crashed through the glass ceiling of a Saint-Nazaire railway car. However, the slanted impact slowed his descent enough right before he struck the ground to prevent a fatal crash. German troops discovered him still breathing, with a fractured right arm and leg, damage to his nose and an eye, plus 28 shrapnel injuries, hanging on by a thread. Shocked to find him alive, they rushed him medical attention on the spot. Following care, he pulled through and endured 18 months in captivity as a POW until Allied troops freed his camp in 1945. He went on to reach 84 years old. He himself couldn't quite explain his survival. Yet what's truly remarkable is that Alan wasn't alone in such ordeals. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran operated the tail guns on a B-17 dubbed Ricky Tick Taravi amid a bombing run over Germany. Enemy Luftwaffe pilots hammered his aircraft fiercely. He took bullets in both arms. A blast cracked his ribs. Compounding the chaos, his parachute lay in shreds. Then a devastating strike ripped the tail clean off the main body, leaving Moran trapped in the isolated rear, hurtling earthward from roughly 20,000 feet. Plunging at about 100 feet per second, he quit fighting it, braced for inevitable doom, and attempted to steady himself. The plummeting tail snagged a towering pine, cushioning the landing sufficiently to spare his life upon touchdown. Arriving German forces at the wreckage were astonished to see him conscious. Though his wounds were grave, a smashed skull among them, he received treatment, tended by a Serbian POW physician using limited resources, who miraculously sustained him. Moran lasted through 18 months in German POW camps and witnessed the liberation. Back in January 1944, tail gunner James, aboard a B-17 named Skippy, faced a parallel nightmare close to Athens after his plane smashed into another fortress amid the clouds. Similar to Moran, he dropped inside the severed tail section. During the descent, he hadn't even noticed his separation from the main aircraft. What seemed an endless free fall of a few minutes ended when his tail crashed into trees that halted his plunge and preserved him. He extricated himself from the wreckage and only then grasped his isolation. Greek Orthodox monks eventually saved James. If you figure enduring a 20,000-foot drop sans parachute or soaring tailless mark the pinnacle of bomber fortune, ponder the ordeal of the B-17 Lovely Julie above Cologne on October 15, 1944, struck by direct flak that sheared away the whole forward section. First Lieutenant Lawrence de Lansancy had barely seen his bombardier drop the payload when a shell detonated in the nose area. The force slew Staff Sergeant George Abbott right away, yet his frame shielded the rest of the team from the bulk of the fragments. The nose vanished entirely. Plexiglass and metal covering evaporated, exposing the front completely. Instruments lay in ruins. No airspeed gauge, altitude reader, compass or oxygen supply remained. Facing slim prospects, de Lansancy descended to a breathable height, though it exposed them to every German battery from Cologne to the Channel. Navigator Raymond Leaux's charts and gear had vanished in the explosion, forcing him to steer them back across hostile lands without aids, as icy gusts whipped their faces and the plane teetered on collapse. Still, they traversed the Channel in this barely flyable condition and made England. Lacking functional flaps or brakes, de Lansancy managed to set the damaged fortress down on the airstrip without catastrophe, earning the Silver Star for the feat.